Auth is easy, but it's also kind of hard. And in a world where there are more and more options for how to authenticate every single day, and considerations like mobile and web and OAuth and everything else between, it's getting harder to pick a choice. And it's a really scary thing to pick because moving from one auth solution to another is not fun. Take it from someone who's had to do it a few times now. So I'm going to do my best to break down all the options you have today for authentication, from BetterAuth to StackAuth to Clerk to Open Auth to Next.js Auth, there's too many. And we're going to do our best to explain why you would or wouldn't use any single one of them. I'm excited to break this all down with you guys, but first we need to hear from a sponsor, notably not Clerk, because I will not let them influence this video despite the fact that I like them a lot. So let's hear from the sponsor quick. You don't need me to tell you that it's hard to hire great engineers. What you might need is today's sponsor, G2I. I could tell you how great they are, but I'm going to let one of their customers do it. According to ShopMonkey, we've made 17 hires in 60 days. We'll never go back to hiring the old way. And it's not just ShopMonkey saying this. They work with everyone from Webflow to Meta, and the quality of engineers they can hire for you are unbelievable. They have over 8,000 engineers ready to go. They have incredibly high technical standards, and they're not just giving you a list of resumes to look at. They're doing real video interviews, and you can even ask your own questions and get a video response from the candidate. I know there's a lot of recruiting platforms, but there are none I trust quite as much as G2I. If you need proof, go check out React Miami, the best React conference. Sorry, React Conf. If you want to get great engineers in days, not months, pretty hard to beat. Their own stated goal is from interview to PR, it should take less than 7 days. If you're tired of hiring and you need great engineers, these guys are hard to beat. Check them out today at soydev.link/G2I. It's time to talk about the State of Auth and all of the providers that I think are worth covering here. There are quite a few auth solutions. Before we can go into those, we should probably understand the basics of authentication in modern web and mobile applications, as well as the different things auth can mean. I'm going to do something I haven't done in a while. We're going to do a 3-piece Venn diagram here. I would argue there are 3 different pieces to authentication. There is verification. This is verifying that the user is who they say they are. There is user info, which is who is the user, what permissions do they have, what can or can't they do, what's their email, what's their profile picture, all of those things. And there is authentication UI. Think of this as like the sign in button, sign out button, the page where you manage your auth info. And as annoying as it sounds, something like the sign in with Google button, because if you don't do that right, Google can block your app. As someone who's dealt with this before, it is not fun. Even if you just change to a white version of the Google logo instead of using their colorful version at the right size, you'll get axed. Complying with all this stuff sucks, which is why it's nice to have a provider that does all of these things. There's a couple different types of verification though, and these are changing all of the time. Verification has a couple parts. There's the sign-in method, and there is the state storage / verification method. Sign-in method can be things like, I don't know, user pass, passkey, OAuth through another platform. So OAuth, i.e. Google. These are the different ways a user can actually engage with your verification service and do the sign in. Then there is the actual management of that state, because you don't want the user to have to type in their password every time they do anything on their service. So usually things will be stored as access / refresh tokens. These are cookies that exist in the browser based on the service that you're currently using and the sign-in that you did that gets set by the server in order to tell your service who this person is so that you can use that token instead of making them refresh or recheck auth all of the time. People are pointing out another common thing is Magic Link. I don't like them, but yes, Magic Link is another sign-in method here worth calling out. So the most common way to actually store that data is through access or refresh tokens. If we go to the T3 chat code base quick, I can show you guys what those look like for us. Here's our auth actions file. I'm not going to reveal what auth provider we're using just yet, but here we have access token we get from cookies, refresh token we get from cookies. And now that we have these two things, we can verify the user. Subjects is just our validator for the user object shape. Don't worry about that just yet. But our client verify function takes the access token. The reason it takes both is that the refresh token is used once the access token expires. That way, this can be the main thing that you use most of the time to do stuff, but it has a time limit on it, so it's not out there forever. The refresh token is a thing that is used to generate a new access token. And what's really cool is now when we call these functions, if we see the set tokens as cookies, we get a new access token and a new refresh token whenever the user does something that requires the access token be regenerated. So you can almost think of this kind of like you have the token you're using now, and then when it expires, you have this other one to create a new access token. But when you do that, you consume the refresh token and then have to get a new one. So it's almost like a cache where you have the next value ready to go, and then you bump it up whenever you need to re-authenticate the user because they just started using the site after a week of not using it, or the token's been around for a while. This is the most common way to do authentication. There is another pattern that's been catching on for various reasons, which is JWTs. JWT stands for JSON Web Token. A JSON Web Token is different because it's not just a cookie that exists in the HTTP cookies. This is an actual value that exists in your local storage. For a quick example of a JSON Web Token, here is ping. Ping has all of these different values in your local storage, and one of those is your NextAuth message, which contains the auth state. We also have cookies that have your more traditional access refresh tokens, but we have this here, so you have that data for the client if you want to render their profile picture, email, and whatnot. JWTs, depending on how you implement them, can also expire. If we go to something like Upload Thing also has JWTs, but they're doing it more traditionally, but also less so because all through Clerk. Here is where this token is set, all the info, in this case that we get from Clerk, to know who you are. And this token is a JSON object in local storage. It's not a cookie. What's interesting about this token is that it has a very short revalidation window. It actually goes invalid every minute. We'll talk a bit about that later on. The important thing to understand here is these are the main two methods for storing the authentication state. You have the access refresh token option, which are checked whenever a user does something that requires auth, and they are consumed if they are out of date, or you have the JWTs, which are JSON Web Tokens. These are stored in local storage and have an invalidation method that is server-side with a specific amount of time they last for, but they live in the browser storage, which means they're susceptible to being hijacked by things like Chrome extensions, but it also means that your app can access them to do a lot of different things, and you don't have to do all of the work to do revalidations constantly the same way you do with access refresh tokens. So they also allow you to skip a bunch of steps and checks a lot of the time. Now that we have the basics there, we need to talk about the user info. As I had hinted at before, JWTs can contain user info, but that shouldn't be the only place it goes. This needs to be in a database somewhere. The database can be a lot of different things. It could be something provided by the auth provider, like Clerk or Auth0. It could be something that's in your own database, something like BetterAuth or StackAuth or NextAuth/Auth.js. I'll do that. Or it can not exist at all and you just keep it locally, which is funny enough, kind of what we're doing right now with T3 chat. We'll go into that in a bit. But the user info and where it is stored is an important consideration to make, especially depending on what you want to do with user info, that different things will help with and others might hurt with. And then we have Authentication UI. Authentication UI is, as I was saying before, all the things you can click on and do to actually auth, see your auth state, and manage everything between. So let's talk about these different auth solutions. I want to start with a real basic one. So we're going to start with OpenAuth. It's also one that I'm very familiar with because I've been using it more recently. OpenAuth is created by Dax and crew over at SST. OpenAuth is a really fun starting point because it's both as simple as it can get, but that also kind of makes it more complex to implement. If we view the docs, we'll see here, OpenAuth is a standards-based auth provider for web apps, mobile apps, yada, yada. They do have a default UI that you can use. I didn't use it. I'm assuming that most didn't. But if we read through their approach, you'll start to get what they're doing. While there are many open source solutions for auth, almost all of them are libraries meant to be embedded into a single app. Centralized auth servers typically are delivered as software as a service services like Auth0 or Clerk. OpenAuth instead is a centralized auth server that runs on your own infra, designed for ease of self-hosting. It can be used to authenticate basically anything, and it mostly adheres to OAuth 2, but it doesn't do a lot of things you might be expecting it to. OpenAuth very intentionally does not attempt to solve user management. So if we go back to the diagram here, OpenAuth is explicitly not doing user info stuff. They are not helping you manage user sessions. They are just letting you know, thumbs up or thumbs down, is this person who they say they are? So OpenAuth, I would say, squarely fits in the verification and basically nothing else. And that's actually really nice that there's finally a good modern solution for this. It means you have to plug all the pieces in yourself, you have to figure out all the parts yourself, and that you have to write the authentication UI or maybe use the template that they have an example of there. But it is nice if this is all you want. We finally have a relatively modern solution for it. I've actually been frustrated at how few things do this, and it ended up being really useful for us because we want to do some crazy custom stuff with T3 chat. This made it way easier. It still took me 2 days to set up, and it resulted in me very much missing my usual go-to choice of Clerk. But it's a good solution if you want to own all of the pieces. If you want to own all of the pieces in a way that's pre-built for you, the origin for a lot of us is NextAuth, also known as Auth.js. Auth.js is what we used for ping.gg, the video call app. Auth.js is built originally largely around Next.js, but now it works with other things as well. They have a bunch of providers included. They have a bunch of middleware helpers included, a bunch of functions. But the biggest detail that differs here between something like them and OpenAuth is you have to have a data model that you attach it to, usually through a database, sometimes through things like Prisma or Drizzle. But you have to look through here and look through the database adapter, make sure you provide all the different methods that it expects. They do have integrations for a lot of them. Like if we look up Prisma, in here, you use the Prisma adapter with NextAuth in order for NextAuth to know where it's going to actually store these things, which has some fun issues, specifically edge compatibility, because Prisma can't run on the edge, so you can't run this in middleware, which is annoying. They've had a bunch of different workarounds over time, but you also have to add to your Prisma schema. So you can't just plug this in and expect it to work. You actually have to update your database model to include user and account and session and verification token and authenticator. Here is the problem. Now you are managing all of this yourself. This has benefits in that you can do things that might be annoying otherwise. Like, let's say in our database we have table user also has friends, which is a user array. If I did this with OpenAuth, I'm kind of screwed. Unless I personally found a database to store all this data in and had a model for that, good luck, have fun. But if I have a user table that is controlled by NextAuth, now I can just do this join and have all the data I need to render their profile pictures. What you have to do if you're using something like, I don't know, Clerk or OpenAuth is friends is now a string array, which is going to be user IDs. So it's friend IDs. And now I have to have a way to turn each of these friend IDs into a user object in order to render all of the things for those users. If I had to make a friends list or an org list right now in T3 chat, I don't know how I'd even get started with that. It would be really annoying to do with the way we have things set up because we're not storing any of that user data. It only exists in the user session, which exists on their device. Apparently, NextAuth now uses JWTs by default, so you can actually get it working without a database, but you lose all of the benefits of selecting from a table that I was just going over. But if you want a database, you can still set it up. Like if you're doing magic links, you will need it. If you're doing traditional session tokens, you'll need it. They have adapters for like everything. But that's also kind of the problem, is the amount of stuff here can get absurd. And I didn't even know that they had this new path where you can skip the database entirely. And I don't know if I can recommend it or not because I haven't personally tried it. But the best thing provided by Auth.js by far is providers. See this list? This is all of the OAuth implementations that they already have handled for you. And some of these are obnoxious. Like the way that Twitch, for example, does refresh tokens, it does not follow OAuth spec. It has a bunch of weird quirks. But if you use the Twitch provider from Auth.js, I'm pretty sure it can handle the revalidation of those tokens for you. I know I had to write it myself in the past, but I think they figured that out. If not, I'm sorry if I misled you. But they have all of these pieces to do auth for a lot of different places. And I've even used these implementations as references when working on my own auth layers in other places. So if you want to have sign-in for basically everything that's ever existed, but own it all yourself, Auth.js has you covered for all these different OAuth providers. They have a solution to embed it in your database. They have some UI pieces already built for you, but admittedly not much. Personally, I would say NextAuth very squarely falls in between user info and verification, although apparently now you can just use it for verification, which is news to me. Feels a little heavy for that. But if you want to have your user info in your database, you want to have all these verification patterns, and you want it to be built deeply into Next.js, NextAuth/Auth.js seem to be fine today. But there is a solution that a lot of people say are better. That solution is BetterAuth. BetterAuth does require a database, but it also supports a very similar set of things that NextAuth does. But it has a lot less tech debt from trying to support people who were using it 4 or 5 years ago. It's a relatively new solution that is built heavily around TypeScript and modern best practices that seems genuinely really good. I personally have not used BetterAuth yet. This is the first one I've covered that I have not done myself. But the setup actually seems relatively simple. has a lot of cool features, even has organization and access control, which honestly kind of is its own fourth thing that I didn't put in that Venn diagram, but it's nice that they have it. NextAuth leaves these things to the user to explore. Here's why you might want to use BetterAuth over other auth libraries. If you need more features, you need support for other frameworks, you need advanced features like TUFA, multi-tenancy, multi-session, admin tools, rate limiting, etc. You want more control over your auth flow, for more comprehensive docs, like the idea of a plugin system to extend it. If you want to use a library that's actively maintained as a growing community. I won't comment on the State of Auth.js maintenance because I know that the lead maintainer there is working really hard, but he also has a full-time job he's working really hard on too. But this library does seem to be in a really good place. Setup's relatively simple. You install the package, create a secret key, you create the folders that it needs to actually do things. You have your Auth.js that creates the BetterAuth client, and then you have to configure your database. Because again, this needs to be stored somewhere, and they will just hold your hand in storing it in your DB. So they have examples here with different SQL dialects. You can switch to Postgres or whatever else, and see that they let you wrap your database with your BetterAuth provider. Or if you have an ORM like Prisma or Drizzle, they've created specific adapters for those too, which is quite nice. You do have to create the tables though. You can call their generate and migrate functions, which feels a bit weird. I personally would have preferred if they just gave me the code to go dump into my Drizzle schema, but I get why they did it this way. They want to make sure everything is perfectly configured. And if you have just like a 1 character difference between your setup and how you have the database modeled and how they do, it's hellish. I may or may not have a patch package on our auth solution for ping.gg because they changed the name of a field and it was easier to rename it on the package than it was to update our database without breaking things. So it is what it is. You then have to create a client instance with a base URL. It holds your hand through gluing all the parts together, but they do need to be glued together. They're not going to do that for you. You have to build the relationship between the database, the auth client, your code base, and the user client experience too. All of these things have to be orchestrated and pulled together. They help you a lot through it, and I know the community is really supportive, but you do need to own all these parts. NextAuth, you do as well, but they let you skip some of them now, which is cool, but it is really nice to have all of these things. They also have a set of social sign-ins here, nowhere near as many as NextAuth does, but you could implement it yourself if you need. Regardless, they have a bunch of the most common ones, but if you need something that's not on the list, that's your problem. But they do support a lot of frameworks, and I've heard much better things about the BetterAuth support in something like SvelteKit than I've heard about with Auth.js. So if you need an auth solution that is built into your framework, but isn't built into the Next.js framework, BetterAuth is a really good solution for it. Apparently, you can set up the Drizzle stuff yourself, but I didn't see it. So if you can DIY it in Drizzle, I want to see it. It would be nice if they just showed me the code in here. Yeah, that's my issue with that. The plugin system is really cool, though. The fact that they have plugins for things like two-factor, for proper username, unique support, for phone numbers, magic links, email OTP, passkeys, traditional generic OAuth, and so much more. I like the plugin system a lot. That is really cool and probably one of the biggest reasons you would want to consider this. They even have a NextAuth migration guide. Honestly, I should consider this for the ping site. Ooh, they have an optimized for performance. They already have used cache examples. That's really nice, actually. But do they have components? Using it with custom components? No, it does not look like they have components. Okay, that's pretty cool, actually. On the website, they have this fun UI to create the exact sign-in experience that you want. You click continue, click the framework you want. It only has support for these in Next, but interesting. That's the auth client, and then the sign-in TSX. It generates the component using Tailwind for you. Cool. This is interesting because it's not owning the client. This almost feels like, God, I don't want to go find the old Excalibur file, but this feels similar to like my styles libraries rant, where there are the components that are provided as part of the package, but there's also components that are provided as a copy-pastable thing. And this is going the shadcn direction where you actually copy-paste the code. And this isn't something from their package. This is something that is generated based on your specific needs. They even inline the SVGs for all those logos. They aren't compliant with Google here, though. Google will actually ban your app from OAuth if you try to get approval for higher scopes with this. So be careful. It's stupid, but the fact that the Google logo isn't Google's colors here and isn't a certain size will get you in trouble with them because they suck. So just know that going in, that this isn't necessarily client code that is 100% ready to go for the expectations of these providers, but at the very least, it gives you the right starting point. Whew. I think it's fair to say now that I've done this deep dive that our friends over at BetterAuth are in a really good spot. And I would say pretty confidently they fit here. The catch being you have to own all those parts yourself and glue it all together, but you can absolutely do that. And as long as you have a good database to store it in and you want all of these things tied up, you're good. It's in a really good state. And I honestly, if I really didn't want to use an auth service, I think BetterAuth is pretty high up on my list. But the reality is I do usually want to use an auth service, and Clerk, if you know anything about them, is also right here. So obviously account for some bias. Clerk is a sponsor. But what you might not know is when Clerk first came out, I would roast the shit out of the CEO at events. We would go to a lot of different tech events in SF, and I'd run into him, and the whole time he would just listen to me explaining why auth as a service makes no sense. It's so easy to set up yourself now. Who would care? He would just look at me and smile, say, "We'll get you someday, man." And then they did. And the way they got me was honestly a little silly. It was React Native. I wanted an auth solution that also worked well for my native and mobile apps. And what I had built with NextAuth was not there. And I didn't actually check this with Better Auth, but as they had said in their docs, the goal of this was to be built around your full stack framework. It is framework agnostic, but it's deeply built into your framework. But what happens if you want to access that auth elsewhere, like React Native, Expo integration? They have a way to configure the Better Auth backend with Expo, but how do I access it on a React Native app if it's hosted somewhere else? Do they actually have a solution for this? Oh, they do. Cool. Yeah, I can put a different client URL. Nice. BetterAuth is the first open source solution I've seen that has a somewhat happy path for getting it working in React Native. That is nice. What they aren't helping with, though, and I can pretty confidently say scrolling through this, is all the weirdness with signing in with Google, where it has to open up a web view that you sign in with and then kick you back to the right place in the app. Is this all still the Expo integration? Maybe they do have that. Because they're using cookies with BetterAuth, and because cookies aren't a real thing on mobile, in order to hit an API with your authenticated state, you have to use their custom fetch function. This is the problem. The fact that to authenticate the user, you can't rely on HTTP cookies to be part of the request. You have to use this instead. All of these parts are annoying. And I'm so thankful they have a path at all and that they built all these solutions. It's genuinely really cool that someone took solving the React Native and Expo problem seriously. But if you're building a Swift app, good luck. If you're building a Kotlin app, good luck. If you're building a Flutter app, good luck. Not saying this is a bad thing. It's awesome that BetterAuth is in the state it's in, and that for most people, most of the time, it's good. But Clerk goes further. They just today actually put out their support officially for Nuxt and Vue, which is dope. But they support a ton of different things, including Expo, obviously, Chrome extensions, which are obnoxious, iOS, Straight Node, Express, React Router, Remix, TanStack Start. They're actually sponsoring TanStack Start. Go, Astro, Nuxt, you get the idea. The reason Clerk can do all these things is they're a well-funded company that is doing nothing but auth. That also means they're not traditionally open source. The packages that you install in your app are, but the actual infra side isn't. It also means they cost money. I'll just jump in front of the pricing. If you have 10,000 users a month or less, it is free. If you have more than 10,000, then it's $25 a month, then 2 cents per additional user. But you also get some fun additional features there. And I'm sure that the enterprise pricing is different, but I'm happy with the $25 a month plan. I do have frustrations with it. Specifically, my biggest frustration, I've told them all of this. They know my pain points. The biggest one I have is if I'm paying for one app and I want features in another app that has way fewer users, I have to pay the $25 a month for that. They are working on this from what I know, no guarantees, but I think I successfully bullied them into letting you pay per Clerk account or org instead of per app, which is really annoying. But something like, for example, Marker Thing, which is what I use for orchestrating my content post-stream. So I'll go to a given stream I did, like Ghosty is here. And in here, I have all the things I talked about, which I export into a CSV and then use to auto-chop my stream into content for my editor. This is a tool that gets used by like 15 people, but I really wanted longer sessions. So I was tired of having to sign out and back in. But the longer session times was a paid feature. I was going to pay $25 a month for just this one app with 15 users. So that's a gotcha for sure. But holy hell is the integration so much smoother than anything else I've ever done with Auth. It literally takes me under 5 minutes to add Clerk properly to something. And it's so nice. It is worth the money to me. One other notable thing about the user count, and this is like my favorite thing Clerk ever did. A user is counted as active when they return to your app 24 plus hours after signing up. So if you have a huge surge of users because you went viral, and then they all go up to your app, they all sign in, they play with it quick, and then leave and never come back, you're not billed for them. You're only billed for the users that are recurring in your app. And what's funny here is something like Upload Thing doesn't end up with a very high MAU number simply because people will sign in for the first time, set it up, grab their API key, throw it in their app, and then not go to the Upload Thing dashboard again, which means that we don't have a crazy number for this. And I don't even know if we're over the count where we'd be charged more or not right now, because most people go to the dashboard once and then do everything else through their code base instead. So don't worry about a huge surge of traffic. I wish more companies would implement this because it is a really, really nice thing. I've been bugging other people I work with about this because I want this to be how billing works everywhere I go. The biggest thing they push is their client components though, which are for the most part really good, but there are catches. I actually have in my notes for this video, I am mad about components in Clerk. It's one of the biggest reasons I'm doing this video because I've been getting increasingly frustrated with them. If we go back to marker thing, pay attention to this corner, my profile picture here. You notice something. It comes in late. If I didn't intentionally wrap this with a box of the right size, it would pop in. So the button would go right and then shift left once this appeared. There is no server rendering for their components. And as a person who quite likes server rendering, it is obnoxious. And as a result, we ended up rewriting almost all of the components for Upload Thing. We made our own org switcher. We made our own user card, which I'm not going to open because it's going to show my personal data. We did that because we wanted more control. But if you don't need that control, you're just trying to get Auth working well, Clerk makes it so nice. So yeah, when I click this, we get this fancy component where I can manage my user info. I can sign out, all just baked in the free tier. You just mount the component. It takes seconds to set up well. And since the auth itself is hosted by Clerk, not as part of your Next app, it's really easy to just connect whatever else to an existing Clerk setup. So if you want to have a Next.js code base and then you add a React Native app later on, you're good to go. You have the exact same auth state across everything. And when I was trying to find a solution for React Native, that's when I gave Clerk an honest go and very quickly realized I don't want to ever do this myself again. And I went through it with OpenAuth, and the whole time I was doing OpenAuth, I was just missing Clerk. And that's not like an ad, that's just my reality. It's so simple to set up. We just go to the next implementation, you install the package, you get your API keys from their dashboard, you add the Clerk middleware function, then you wrap your app with a Clerk provider. You're basically done. You install, grab the tokens from their dashboard. You use a middleware in Next.js, which is really simple and solves a lot of problems, but there's a catch we'll get to. The middleware in Next.js is a function that runs on the edge before a request is actually forwarded on. It's really useful for things like changing the URL someone is going to, where if a user is going to /profile, but they're not signed in, you might want to redirect them to /signin. Instead of waiting for the page to load, realize that it's the wrong page and redirect you, middleware will run when the user makes the request and then send them to the right place. They have a middleware function they provide for you that will check your authentication and even let you configure it to not let people into certain pages. By default, they were actually very aggressive with that configuration, and I yelled at them a bunch, and now they're less aggressive with it. Now you can create a route matcher, which says you want to protect these routes. So we have a protected route matcher that says you can't go to dashboard or form unless you are authed. So if is protected route, await auth.protect. Now these routes cannot be accessed unless the user is signed in. This is really convenient, and I will never fucking use it. This is a feature that I'm sure makes a lot of sense for things like internal tools and platforms. I like controlling these states myself, and I will not put them in my middleware. If you look at the middleware for any service that we have that is using Clerk, it's almost always really, really simple. This is the actual middleware for marker thing. It's simple because I don't care if you go to a page authenticated or not. I just want to make sure that the token is verified and that I know that you are you. Once you have that set up, the rest is easy. You wrap your app with the Clerk provider, and then you render a sign out or signed in component that they provide, and you're done. Like, that's it. You've set up auth fully. If you need data about the user, you use the Clerk SDK. So if I want to get user info, I can call auth or current user, which are functions that they provide to get that info. So if we have a page that we want to return different content depending on the user ID, const user ID equals await auth, and now we can query our database. There is a catch though, which is that it's not our database it's in. So if we go back to the example of a friend table, if I want to get all of my friends, I might have a thing in Clerk's user object that is my friend IDs, but now I have to use those IDs to go fetch all of the users from Clerk's SDK. There's no way to join between the Clerk table and your own data. You can set up Clerk to also dump all the data into your database and update it with webhooks, but I've never actually seen anyone do that. It's a feature they support, but yeah, I don't find myself needing it too often. I've actually been very surprised how rarely it is that I need the user table in a way that I can't just fetch it from their API. So if we look at a service like MarkerThing, this service doesn't have a database at all. It is just using Clerk, which is really cool because it has to do some annoying things. So this is the markerthing.com/Theo route. I could have locked this so only I can go to it, but it's currently set up that any signed in user can access this. And the way I did that is I get the VOD with markers param.slug token, but that might be using the wrong token. Shit, this code is broken actually. I should fix this later. If I had written this code correctly, which it's funny, I'm just realizing now that I didn't, I could get the Twitch token from Clerk without having your user ID at all and just get the OAuth token, which is really, really nice because I can give access to my VODs page to other people on my team without needing a database, without needing to store it somewhere else. I can get the token for Theo, even if I'm on account Ben or FaZe or someone else on my team, because I can just use the Clerk SDK and request from it based on a user's ID, I want their OAuth Twitch token. And they'll handle the revalidation and refreshing and all of that for you so that I can access the Twitch API with this token without having to hack around a bunch of shit. Normally, this would require a bunch of stuff in database, and I've built this app 3 times, and most of the times I had to have a database for it. But Clerk gave me everything I needed to skip that part, and the rest is all just built using the Twitch APIs and the token that they give me. I think that is really, really nice. And I have been blown away at how convenient this whole flow is. It has significantly simplified a lot of the things I have written, and it's all comes together in the reason I personally pick Clerk most of the time. It's really easy to get things started the way you want to. They have an SDK that gets you all of the data you might need and all the weird edge cases I don't feel like handling. And the result is I get Auth working really quickly. Instead of it taking me a day, it takes me a few minutes. And then eventually later on, there are a couple of things that annoy me that I have to fight with, and I DM the team and they fix it, and it's all good in the end. But I genuinely really like Clerk, enough that my frustrations with components not rendering on the server, and my biggest frustration, which is the middleware insisting on running always on everything. These are things I can get over because it makes the rest so simple that I don't care that much. But I do need to do a tangent for the middleware thing. Since Clerk runs on middleware, that means that Clerk runs on every request to my site. That means that my static pages aren't going to show up immediately, because even if the page itself is static, you have to go through this middleware function, give the thumbs up or thumbs down for that user, and then you can send them the actual page data. That means if you put Clerk on your blog, it will feel notably slower even if only one page is authed. You can put a custom matcher function so the middleware only runs on certain routes, but it is annoying at best. This file's existence inherently means your site's going to feel slightly slower. They have some things that help. Like, it's not going to call the Clerk backend every single time any request is made. They have a really interesting strategy with JWTs, where it's a JWT, so it's stored and can be used on different platforms, but it also is invalidated every minute, which means the first time I go to the page, like when I go to uploadthing.com, it has to revalidate me initially. But once it's revalidated me and given me that new cookie, all of the requests that follow from there for the next minute don't require a revalidation, so it can get through the middleware much faster. But that first request, if you haven't been to the website for a minute, that request will block the first response. Not my favorite thing. Very helpful. Not my favorite thing when I'm trying to build apps that are showing off how performant they are. It would also be a killer, like just absolutely destroy something like T3 chat, which I want everything to be local for. Since the middleware is what authenticates the user, determines if they are or aren't properly authenticated, it has to be hit on basically every request. That sucks if you want things to load without having to make an additional request. If you want it to just be cached locally on the user's device, that way of building isn't great. I am sure there are ways in Clerk to change my verification validation methods. They were not easy enough for me to identify, figure out, and set up, so I rolled my own with OpenAuth instead. This is the first time I built something without Clerk in a while, and I miss it dearly. But it really makes me appreciate both the strengths and the weaknesses of a hosted auth provider like Clerk. Now I need to talk about Lucia Auth. Not sure I'm supposed to pronounce it. Every time I pronounce the name Lucia, somebody gets mad at me. All I have to say here is Pilcrow is deprecating it. They've made recommendations for other things you should look at and use, including Auth.js. But as great as Lucia Auth was, they are planning on deprecating it. I like that they're being this upfront about it. They feel like it isn't working. I now implement sessions from scratch and don't use the library for my personal projects. There's nothing more heartbreaking than building a library or a solution and finding yourself not using it because it's frustrating you. I feel for Pilcrow. I've been there. It's not a good spot to be. And as they also call out, the database adapters are a significant complexity task. The fact that the library is syncing to your database makes it really annoying to maintain. To go back to OpenAuth for a sec, 'cause I forgot to mention this part. OpenAuth solves this by making you have your own KV store. And the KV store just manages the tokens and nothing else. Yeah. So when you set up OpenAuth, you need to bring your own storage. They recommend DynamoDB or Cloudflare KV. Just needs to be a KV store of some form. But you need somewhere to store that data. You can't access it outside of Auth, but all this is being used for is verifying and validating the user session. But it is not meant to be the same database you use for everything else. It is just the authentication layer. And it's nice that this is isolated. Like, we're using Vercel and Next.js with a bunch of hacks for T3 chat, but I am hosting the auth over on Cloudflare KV and Cloudflare Workers because they made it really easy to do that in its own isolated, separate thing. And all these other solutions have these really complex database adapters to handle all the different places the data might live. Maintaining it has sucked for Auth.js, it's sucked for Pilcrow working on Lucia, and I'm sure it sucks for BetterAuth as well. And it is basically necessary if you're storing the user data in your database. And thankfully, they called this out and that they're planning on deprecating and going out of their way to guide people in the right direction. But they also had a really good post I wanted to cover here, back to the middleware thing. Please stop using middleware to protect your routes. There seems to be a certain group of people that is adamant on middleware being used to handle authorization. Middleware refers to functions that run before every request. So every single request is going to have this is protected call where they're going to check to see if the path is protected. And if it is, they're going to validate the request, check the user, and then forward them the right place if they are auth or give a 401 if they're not. I don't like this approach. I'm just confused at this point since you're just re-implementing routing logic with middleware, an API provided by your routing library. And what do you do when you need to protect routes based on the user's roles instead? Like if you have a page you only want admins to go to, you're just going to keep making your middleware more complex. And the more complex your middleware gets, the slower it runs, and the slower everything else goes in your app. While route-level middleware may help in the simple example, routes in real-world apps aren't often organized by the required permissions. What happens if you have multiple roles? What if you need to implement different rate limits on each route based on user roles? How about API access token permissions and scopes? It isn't surprising that this happened given how loosey-goosey crossed out powerful JS can be. Auth, which includes both authentication and authorization, important distinction. I have a whole video about this if you haven't seen it. Authentication is making sure a user is who they say they are. Authorization is making sure they can do what they want to do. Different things. And since people are scared of auth, they end up making things more complex than they need to be. And I like this. I personally like checking auth on the route rather than at a higher up middleware layer. Maybe you have a middleware that assigns auth to the request, but middleware that decides what the request does, bad every time. One common response I get is that middleware prevents devs from accidentally forgetting to add auth checks. Add your fucking auth checks. Thank you, Pilcrow, for that. I'm happy we agree on this. Yeah, so sadly, Lucia doesn't really have a place in this anymore. It's a little sad. It'll be missed, but I'm thankful they've done the right thing. They've documented everything they've done throughout, and they recommend other solutions like Auth.js and BetterAuth now. And now for our final contender, StackAuth. Quick biases. I'm an investor in Stack. I also am an investor and a sponsor of Clerk. So these are the two I'm the most biased about. There's a reason I'm sponsoring and working with and investing in these companies because these things suck to build and these companies are doing a good job of making a great solution. The big difference between StackAuth and Clerk is that StackAuth is fully open source. It's not open source client code and packages. It's open source everything. But it is also much earlier along. You will run into more issues here because they just got started somewhat recently. Don't tell me that their GitHub link isn't fucking target blank. Come on, guys. They have a lot of the components and fancy features that you expect from something like Clerk, which is really nice. And it looks like their sign-in is compliant with Google's rules. Look at that. Cool features, all the stuff that you would expect there. And it's open source. So you can work the GitHub and see what features they're adding and when and annoy them with issues and all of that. You can have them host for you. Their free tier is basically identical to what you get from something like Clerk. They don't charge for orgs, which is nice. Clerk does once you have a certain number of them. And then they have a team price, which is a bit more expensive, but it's for when you want more dashboard admins. Quite expensive, but they're pricing it differently. It's a very good alternative, and if you don't like the pricing, you can self-host it. But if you want to let them do it for you, that is really nice. I am assuming, I've never actually set it up, but my assumption is when you self-host, they call out, if you want to self-host, be careful. It's a complex project with a lot of interdependent services to manage them all independently. Updates will be more annoying. Reliability won't be quite as high as they could theoretically do, etc. The catch is you need to have your API backend. You need to have a dashboard for people to access, a client SDK. That's already provided. A Postgres DB. They have Prisma set up as their ORM for it. Sphinx, which is how you manage the webhooks in and out. And then an email server as well. Not too bad, and you can absolutely set this up yourself. If anything, StackAuth would be a really cool reference for rolling your own full auth platform for your application. I would argue the best time to think about something like StackAuth is if you want the quick setup that you get from Clerk, but you also want the possibility to, admittedly, put a lot of work in to exit and self-host in the future. They have a slightly happier path there than you do on something like Clerk. Funny enough, I've talked a lot with the Clerk team about an export feature where you could export your Clerk setup to something else that's open source or self-hosted. The biggest problem they've run into trying to figure it out is figuring out what to let you export to, because there's so many different options and they all have such weird expectations that building an export feature is hard. Is exporting important to you? Do you need a way to move off the paid solution if you want to host it internally at your own company in the future? StackAuth is a thing worth considering. I'm excited about what these guys are doing. I really like the founders. They're a fun team. I chat with them all the time. But I would say of the options, StackAuth is the biggest bet being made. It still touches everything in your code base when you set it up the same way something like Clerk does, or even more so like BetterAuth does. But you can exit and self-host if you want, which is a really nice benefit that isn't offered by Clerk right now. Personally, I still use Clerk when I'm building new apps. There's a reason that I recommend them as much as I do. I think they are a really happy path almost always for almost everyone. But StackAuth is the first, what I would call real competition for Clerk. People keep bringing up Passport, and it's worth at least mentioning. It hasn't gotten an update in 5 months. And that update was the README. What did they change in it? It just added prefers color scheme light and dark. Yeah. This is the OG auth library for Express, where you'd throw it in your middleware and check a cookie. It's fine. They're sponsored by every auth company now because they all desperately want to pull people auth because Passport is what we used for node services back in 2014. I haven't seen anyone building a new thing with Passport in a fucking while, I'll be honest. But if you really want to, it exists still. It very, very squarely falls in that top section here where it's literally just the verification layer, and they don't even prescribe storage solutions. So you got to own pretty much everything yourself there, but it exists. I wouldn't use it for anything. Yeah. And chat should be enough a reason here to not touch it. Passport's very old. Look at the commit in the support folder. Oh God. Lib hasn't had a commit for 2 years. Jesus. Yeah. This is going to be a hard sell for me today. I can tell you where to move from it if you want to do that. But yeah, people were not happy. Please not Passport. It's 2025 or better than this. Horror stories. Yeah. I forgot to touch on WorkOS. WorkOS is really cool. They're much more focused on enterprise auth. They have happy paths for things like Next.js. But I'm a big company. I have weird expectations about GDPR stuff that I have to manage and deal with. Crazy SAML SSO bullshit that I don't know how to implement. I want everything to just work, and I'm down to pay for it. WorkOS is a really good solution. Again, really good team. But if you want to have a custom domain for your auth, you're paying $100 a month. If you want to set up SSO with SAML and OIDC, you're paying $125 per connection per month. So it's a different model. They charge it in a different way for different things. But this is if I was building a company with the expectation of having our clients be Microsoft and Jira, and those were the people I wanted to have working with me, WorkOS would be a solution I would reach for. They also created AuthKit. AuthKit's a really cool set of open source components and pieces to assemble your auth with other providers. Obviously, they expect you to use WorkOS in the middle. From what I understand, you can plug AuthKit into other things. And it's also built, funny enough, by a lot of the original Radix team because they were purchased by WorkOS. So yeah, that's why the site's so beautiful. That's why the components are so beautiful. These guys know what they're doing. This is the I'd say WorkOS is the I don't want to take any risk at all and I'm down to pay for it option. But again, it's not one I've personally used because I'm not trying to score Microsoft as a customer. So the missing one, I need to restructure this slightly to have more room in the middle here. So we got StackAuth in here. I would say WorkOS by default is here, but if you combine WorkOS with AuthKit, it moves it here because AuthKit, as far as I understand, is largely just here. I think I've covered mostly everything here. Firebase and Supabase Auth. I have heard so many weird problems with Firebase Auth. I don't even really want to cover it. It's cheap, but I've also heard it just randomly gets hit with crazy rate limits and prevents users from signing in. And as soon as I mention Firebase, resident hacker Eva very loudly hears it because it's so easy to set up Firebase incorrectly that there are whole cultures of exploits built around it. Eva was able to pwn 900 sites and 125 million accounts with one vulnerability. That isn't necessarily that Firebase is vulnerable itself, but the way that they encourage you set it up is so often wrong that half, I would guess, of Firebase implementations have misconfigurations in things. I have a whole video about this if you want to check it out, but yeah, be careful with Firebase. Plain text passwords. Yeah. The good old days. So yeah, Firebase Auth sucks. Supabase has their own auth. I don't know how they charge for it. A lot of these database providers like Supabase and Firebase have auth built in. It is significantly less full-featured than it would be from a service like Clerk or Auth0 or StackAuth because they're not an auth company. And getting all of the pieces like the revalidation of tokens and managing permissions on Google and that stuff is not easy to do. And as far as I know, they don't do any of it. Convex also authors Auth because of this reason. A lot of these platforms offer it because usually the expectation is Auth lives in the DB. And if these platforms also have a permissions model, which Convex does, because you can give permissions to what a user can or can't do, like getting their own messages in a message app. Or with Supabase, because everything is done through row-level security when you use the Supabase SDK, you don't actually set up an API that queries your database. Instead, you use their SDK with a user ID, and it will query and it will fail if the user doesn't have permission for that row. It's a whole different model, and I don't feel like going too deep on it. But Auth exists in Supabase not because they want to compete with Clerk. Auth exists in Supabase because their product requires authentication, and specifically authorization is a key part of how you access data through their platform. I don't like that personally. I prefer my authentication layer and my data layer to be separate. And the way they come together is this wonderful thing you've probably heard of before, an API. So personally, not my thing. I have seen some people who use Supabase for auth and then just treat this database part as a traditional SQL database and query the Postgres through something like Drizzle, and they're just using the auth as free auth. Cool. Happy for you. But it's not going to be anywhere near as flexible and controllable as other platforms that we've covered here. They also don't have multi-factor unless you pay a bunch of money for it. It's expected. I get what they're doing. It makes a lot of sense. And for a company that wants to have everything provided, that doesn't want to pick their database, set up their APIs, create auth, and pull it all together, Supabase is a good option. I would suggest you avoid using the SDK on client and instead run an API. To each their own. One last thing I need to touch on is a cool thing coming in the near future for Next.js. Next.js is adding some new functionality for interrupting requests based on authentication states. It's a new feature. It's only in the Canary right now. But there is an unauthorized function that you can call in a given route if you have the auth interrupts experiment on, which will allow you to do something like this. You have the dashboard page, which is app/dashboard. So this would be localhost 3000/dashboard. In here, we call the session check to get session info. If there is no session, we call the unauthorized function from Next Navigation. Traditionally, what we would do here is redirect them to /signin or something. But now you have an unauthorized function that can be triggered as part of Next's primitives. You would then create an unauthorized.tsx file, similar to a loading TSX or an error TSX file in the Next routing paradigm. That would be what gets hit when you call that unauthorized function. What's really cool is you can even call it in something like a server action. So if a user calls update profile and they're not authorized, you can immediately kick them to that page. Super handy. They're also working on request interceptors. I didn't know about this till now, so this is really, really cool. The problem with middleware is that this has to run on every single request. You can't really have different middleware for different pages in your app. You can't have middleware that only runs on things like actions, but doesn't run on things like page loads. Middleware is very limited. And the new intercept pattern should let you write custom interceptions for different routes. Takes in a next request, can do all these different things. Sample use auth. Okay, so this intercept lives in app/dashboard/interceptor. And the interceptor TS file will run before those pages do. This will allow you to have certain pages that have a blocker without having to do all of that on every single page. This is the actual upload thing code base. And in here we have the app dashboard route. So if I go to uploadthing.com, we go to the dashboard, the URL, you'll see it's /dashboard/uploadthing internal apps, the name of our team here, our org. This URL is encoded in the file routing, but we have all of these things that are shared. The layout wraps all of them. So all of them have this same layout. I confirm team access, and this confirm team access function calls this internal thing that will throw the not found if the team isn't found or you're not signed in. This is a function that we have to run on every single page, which we do via layout, but this function runs after the request has been processed by the Next server and starts creating the page that the user gets. It would be really nice if I could hoist this one layer higher so it runs before Next starts generating pages. It can run on something like, I don't know, a middleware function. Then it can make sure that everything in this directory, everything from this URL down, effectively, is affected by this intercept. And now I don't have to do all of these checks in here anymore because I've handled it slightly higher up. And now the path for all of this code is way simpler. Theoretically, I would have to go check this in every single page if I didn't do it in the layout. And even then, what's really scary is you can fetch the page even if the layout fails. So if my layout here has this confirm function, but the page doesn't, with the right type of interception, you can access a given page even if the layout failed, which is really, really annoying. So not only do you have to check this in the layout layer, you also have to, on every single page in this directory, make sure that you're checking this team access function that we wrote, or a user could theoretically access the page content for a team they're not on. That sucks super hard. It's one of the biggest problems with the new Next.js model, in my opinion. And I did not know they had a planned solution for it. This will theoretically make it so you can use something like Clerk without the middleware entirely, which will be really, really nice. I'm excited as hell about this proposal. Interceptors will opt pages into dynamic rendering. Yes, they should. Cool. Apparently, they don't have Edge runtime support yet. That's annoying, but this is so much better. I'm actually really happy to see that that's happening. That'll make a lot of my pain points with most of these libraries way less bad. Eva, Resident Hacker, has also found a bunch of things with Next.js actions and pages where they can execute things via client-side JS that they shouldn't be able to. Yeah, really good info. One more thing I didn't mention that I just want to make sure my stance is very clear. Of these options, OAuth is my favorite. Passkeys are annoying, but fine. I'm just annoyed that the UX for them is as bad as it is. Like when I sign in with a passkey, I feel like I have to click 5 buttons. Theoretically, it can get better in the future. It hasn't yet. Magic links annoy me, but they're plenty secure. User password is a scourge and it needs to die. If it is even vaguely reasonable for you while implementing auth to not have a user password option, if that is even a choice that you have when setting things up, please take it. The existence of passwords is so archaic and benign and a fundamental failure of software. And the amount of problems they cause, the amount of money that working with them costs, the amount of security issues that come out of passwords is so egregious that just avoiding them is the only realistic option. It sucks that it is that bad, but like Microsoft's been pushing for a while for a passwordless future. They posted a number a long time ago. It was like some number of millions of dollars that Microsoft lost every year doing support calls for their own staff because they forgot a password or a password expired and they couldn't get into their accounts. Passwords cost a ton of money, are an endless source of security issues, are a worse experience for users, and suck to implement properly. Avoid them if you can. Just use OAuth or passkeys or something else. Please, please. I like OAuth. Magic links are fine. Passkeys are getting there. Don't do user pass if you can avoid it. I could spend hours just talking about the nuances of doing JWTs right. Clerk has a bunch of great content on things like JWTs and how to do them right. The thing about JWTs is that they contain in that like JSON a specific authentication code that can be used to check that they are actually who they are. This is another post from their blog that I think is really good. It's part of their How We Roll series, which if you really want to understand Auth, I'd recommend reading through the whole thing. It's pretty cool. They use JWTs. The problem with JWTs is since they contain the auth state in them, you can't invalidate it. So if you like delete a user's account, but the time that token is valid for is still like 3 more hours, the user could still do things and access things because the token is still valid. The solution that they came up with at Clerk is to set the validation time to 60 seconds. So if a user is signed in, you immediately hit the delete account button, they get 60 seconds of being able to make requests before it goes away. But that is basically nothing, and it solves so many of these problems. Specifically, it means you don't have to recheck the user's auth on every single request. Like if they load a page and then they has to make like 15 API calls, each of those API calls doesn't have to double check over on the Clerk side. Each of them can just use the token that it got when the page loaded to do those requests and not have to do the full round trip every time. Really, really nice. Especially considering how painful it is to do these types of invalidations and account deletions. And there are so many JWT setups where if a user gets banned, they can still do things for a while. And again, these are the problems you'll run into if you roll your own auth that I am just so tired of thinking of. Like, how do I get the token to the React Native app? How do I make sure when it's invalidated, the user gets kicked out and they can't do other things? These are all the type of niche, annoying problems you'll run into if you roll your own auth. It's why you should absolutely at least use a library, but it's also the reason I personally lean on things like Clerk and like StackAuth because they've handled all of these problems for me. And I am more than happy to pay $25 a month once I have over 10,000 users to not think about these things. But this really comes down to what your preferences are. Do you want to have full ownership of every part of your tech stack? Do you want to not worry about auth and treat it like a table that isn't your problem? What do you want to own? Hopefully, this helps you guys understand where auth is at, what all these providers are, what the benefits and negatives are for each, why I still use Clerk for pretty much everything, why BetterAuth is where it is, why OpenAuth is a really good solution for a very small number of things, but very good for those. Why I would use each of these. OpenAuth. I'd use OpenAuth if I want to deploy myself. I want simple OAuth behavior. I am okay with auth being standalone, and I want to own it myself. The big thing with OpenAuth is that your auth is a standalone service. So similar to how like Clerk or StackAuth are cloud services that you call to check auth info, OpenAuth is as well. It is a service that you have to host yourself, but it is separate from your app. You don't host it as a route in your app like you do with things like NextAuth or BetterAuth. OpenAuth lives in its own little world and its own little worker. I tried having an OpenAuth worker that also did other things and it was hellish. OpenAuth lives alone in its little isolated bubble. BetterAuth, I want my data in my DB. I want all the pieces owned by me. I want some help doing OAuth connections. And I want a good set of docs and community. And I'm okay with gluing it all together myself. But the key with both of these is you need to really want to own your own auth to have it be justified. For me, OpenAuth was, I had a very specific thing I wanted to do that Clerk wasn't quite equipped for that made it the right choice. It was still painful to get right, but we pulled it off. BetterAuth is a more traditional, like, I want Clerk, but I own it instead. And honestly, it is really hard for me to recommend Auth.js now that BetterAuth is a thing. If you really don't want the data in your database, you know what? Here's what I'll do. Auth.js is, I really don't want the data in my DB, but otherwise I like BetterAuth. The community's not as good. It's not as well maintained, but it's solid. And then Clerk, I want auth that works on everything. I don't mind paying. And the quicker I can get it working, the better. I don't want to deal with weird SAML, SSO BS when we get enterprise customers. Oh, one last Clerk thing. I feel bad even bringing this up because I'm personally annoyed at Clerk at the moment because they have been talking about doing a Stripe integration for so long and it just isn't fucking shipping. Like, here is the video of them demoing it in April of last year. We are at almost a year since they announced they were going to do this, and we still don't have it. So I've called them out privately. Now I'm doing it publicly. What the fuck? When are we getting this? They hired a person full-time to work on it, and I still don't have access as a fucking person who works with them closely. It's so annoying. I even told them straight up, if they had their Stripe integration set up and working, I would have used Clerk instead of OpenAuth for T3 chat. I don't know if this will ever happen. I'll pin a comment if it does, but I, at this point, think it's just vaporware. But man, if they can get this working, it's going to change everything. I have a video coming up soon about how miserable Stripe is to set up, so keep an eye out for that when it drops. What they're adding here that is so exciting is you can connect Stripe to Clerk, and now from Clerk, you can set up users can sub, orgs can sub, what tier options they have, and set that all up inside of Clerk settings instead of inside of Stripe settings. And then when you're a user in the app, you just have a plans and billing tab that handles everything for you. You don't have to set up all of this glue and bullshit yourself. It's so good. You still have to open the Stripe account and link it, but Stripe subscriptions should be tied to a user. You shouldn't have to do that tying yourself. It makes so much sense for this all to be part of Clerk, because then you can get a user from Clerk and it knows if it's subbed or not. So good. This needs to be out. And I'm amazed it is taking as long as it is, and I will continue flaming them for it until I have access. But yeah, if Clerk can get that, it will go from being my default to the only thing I can actually recommend if you charge for your service. But it's been a year. I'm losing hope. Clerk, please win my hope back. You need to do the thing where you work really hard to fix the relationship with Theo again, because it's starting to get bad. And then we have StackAuth. I'd say for this is, I like Clerk, but I want an exit plan. I don't need all the mobile and other integration support yet, and I'm okay with using something really new. I'll put WorkOS in here. WorkOS. My average customer spends $10,000 per month. I want companies like Microsoft using my stuff. IDK, why I'm even watching this video. I haven't built a new app in years. I just work in enterprise software. If these things are true for you, WorkOS is going to make your life much better. Hopefully, this helps clarify when and how I would recommend using any of these solutions. And make sure you account for the fact that I've never used BetterAuth, and I haven't used these two, and I'm an investor in this one, and I'm an investor and a sponsor of this one. But that's where I'm at, doing my best to show you how I think about these things and be as transparent as possible about my relationships with the companies. But I was more than happy to pay Clerk money when I realized how much easier they made my life. I'm very excited to see where StackAuth goes. WorkOS is building the product I feel like I should be using, and I will eventually get there. And the open source options have finally gotten really good. But in order for them to get good, they had to make Auth.js look really bad. They had to let Lucia die, and they had to make Passport look like a fucking meme. And here we are. Here is how I think about all the major auth solutions that I've had people asking about for a bit. They all have value, except for Auth0. And generally speaking, it's kind of hard to pick wrong. I would say if you're picking Auth.js or Auth0, you better have a really good reason for it. But otherwise, these solutions have gotten pretty good. It's a matter of how much do you want to own, how much do you want to build, how much do you want to integrate, and how much do you want to pay. And I think that's about it. Let me know what I missed and flame me for my takes on, I don't know, Firebase. You guys tend to get mad about that. I don't know what else to say here. I've covered Auth top to bottom. So let me know what you guys think. And until next time, peace, nerds.